Thank you.
Just a moment, I'm looking for a file.
While Norm is looking for that file, this is just a reminder to please post any of your questions into the chat, and we will be compiling those and we'll assign them to panelists to be answered at the end of the meeting.
So Brittany, could you share the agenda slide?
I think Bob had that. Bob was going to do that.
Liz, you want? That's the only thing I have that looks like an agenda.
Well, I apologize for this hookup. Our agenda is simple. We'll get started after a very short introduction here. Nelia Dunbar is our first speaker, followed by Hannah Riseley-White, and I will go third. Following that, we will answer the questions that we ask all participants to please put in the chat. Questions or comments will go into the chat. We will select a few questions for the panelists to answer, and then we'll have brief closing remarks and close the meeting. Again, thank you so much for attending. And I think without any further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. And then I'd like them to introduce themselves before we start the presentation. So Dr. Nelia Dunbar is one of New Mexico's top climate and water scientists. She'll tell you more about her background. She is currently the, I believe, Chief Science Officer at New Mexico Tech. Hannah Riseley-White is Deputy Director of the Interstate Stream Commission. I am delighted that she chose to work for the state agencies. She's one of the generation that that is replacing mine and people that are retiring. So you're very effective, Hannah, and we welcome you. I'm Norm Gaume. I'm president of the Rio Grande Water Advocates, and I will present from an advocacy perspective. So Nelia, would you introduce yourself briefly, please?
Sure. Welcome to everyone, and thanks, Norm, for inviting me to participate tonight. As Norm mentioned, I am a geoscientist. I work at New Mexico Tech, and right now I am the interim vice president for research at New Mexico Tech, but in a couple days, I'm going to be very happy to be returning to my regular job, which is the state geologist of New Mexico. So I direct the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, which is a research state-funded agency that is part of New Mexico Tech. So I think I'm going to share my screen and get started. So bear with me here. Okay, I'm hoping you can see my screen, and I'm also going to turn on my pointer. Okay, I'm hoping people can see my mouse on the screen here. So let's see, hold on. Okay. So again, I appreciate Norm inviting me to speak tonight. And what I'm going to talk to you about is a recently completed report that assessed the impacts of climate change on New Mexico's water resources, looking ahead 50 years. And this project was a collaboration between two state-funded agencies, the Interstate Stream Commission and the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. And the vision for this report was to develop a scientifically robust foundation upon which New Mexico's 50-year water plan could be built. Okay, now I can put these slides to advance. There we go. And the report, the final report, is now available. This has been in progress for close to 2 years. And in December 2022, the full report was published. It's a New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources Bulletin 164. It's a fully peer-reviewed and citable product. And you can see a picture of the cover here with all the authors. And this is this is available as a free PDF download through the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources website. And the, the web address is on your screen if you want to take a picture of that. Or if you just go to Google and search for Bureau of Geology Climate Report, you will be able to download the full multi-hundred-page report. So why did we need a report that addresses how climate change in New Mexico, how climate in New Mexico is changing and how it's going to impact water resources? And the basic reason for that is New Mexico's climate is warming. And again, the new 50-year state water plan must account for ongoing and future changes to our climate and our water resource reliability, really to be able to build a robust and meaningful plan. And to give you some hard data on evidence for New Mexico's climate changing, the graph that you can see on your screen shows two things. The top record in red shows the average statewide climate between 1931 and 2020. In blue, the lower part of the graph is similar information for precipitation in New Mexico between 1931 and 2020. So I'm going to focus on the top part of the graph first. And each of these points corresponding to a year is the statewide average precipitation. And you can see from looking at this, somewhat spiky record, you do get a sense of a general increase in temperature. But in order to make that information a little bit more accessible, we also in the report added decadal average values to the temperature information. So each of these bars shows the decadal average of temperature in New Mexico. And what you can see very clearly is for the last 5 decades, the average decadal temperature has stepped up decade over decade. And again, this is instrumental data. This is not modeled information, but is instrumental data. Now, if you look down at the lower graph, you see precipitation. And unlike temperature, which does show a consistent pattern, there is no real trend in precipitation between 1931 and 2020. Now, this is a very spiky record. We've had some very wet years and some very dry years in that time period. But overall, if you look at the decadal averages, there is no real trend in precipitation. Although I would note that if you look here, you can see that 4 of our 5 driest years since 1930 have occurred in the past 2 decades. So that is some information about how New Mexico's climate has changed in the past. And the next thing we want to think about is how New Mexico's climate may change in the future. And here we move from observed data to modeled data. So the graph that I'm showing you here, the orange curve that you can see that I'm pointing out with my mouse is the instrumental record for temperature that you saw in the last graph. Superimposed on that, or looking out to the future, are these 2 bands, a green band and a red band. Those bands represent how we project that temperature is likely to change in New Mexico between now and the year 2100. Now, why do we have the 2 different scenarios? The reason we have the 2 different scenarios is that climate modelers use a range of emissions. We don't really know how greenhouse gases are going to change in the Earth's atmosphere over the next 50 to 100 years. So climate modelers look at different scenarios. The green band would be a more optimistic scenario where greenhouse gas emissions are somewhat lower, not lower than today, but lower, one of the lower projected scenarios. The red band represents modeling of higher emission scenarios, which frankly are probably a little bit more realistic than the green band. So in either case, what we can see is that future temperature increases in New Mexico, that projection is very robust. The real question is, how much is the temperature going to go up, not if it's going to go up. So with that information in hand, we assembled an experienced team of New Mexico research experts to work together and assess the state of knowledge and develop a review report. So there was no new research carried out as part of this study. This study was geared towards pulling together what is known and presenting that to all comers. The ground rules of the study, again, were to assess and synthesize recent scientific literature on climate, hydrology, and the impacts of these changes. And as probably all of you listening to this talk understand, climate change impacts many, many different aspects of New Mexico's ecosystems. It's not just temperature and precipitation, but there's many kind of interconnected effects that happen as climate changes. So the things we were really focusing on in this study: future climate projections, that is chapter 2. Changes to the surface water budget, that's chapter 3. The ecological dynamics that will result from increased temperature and changes to the surface water budget. Then landscape change, wildfires, and erosion, which are all downstream effects of warming climate. We also thought about extreme precipitation and flooding, how climate change is going to impact soils, how it's going to impact water supply and water quality. So all of these different topics that I'm listing here are addressed in this report. To give you some high-level conclusions about how climate change is going to impact New Mexico's water resources in multiple ways, there are a number of things that I'm just going to summarize now to give you a sense of the kind of information you could get a lot more detail about by reading the report. So most importantly, there's going to be lower stream flow and lower recharge to our aquifers because of increasing aridity. There'll be greater interannual variability in precipitation. So we'll have some really nice wet years, but then interspersed with dry years, and also interspersed with hotter and more severe droughts. Snowpack is going to go down, which leads to diminishing snowmelt runoff. There'll be greater demands on groundwater because of lower availability of surface water. Vegetation will be stressed. This leads to increasing catastrophic forest fires, which then in turn leads to increasing flooding and sediment transport. There's concern also that there may be irreversible damage to soils through loss of vegetation and also through erosion. And then finally, something that probably there's the least robust information about, but we're likely to see some degradation in the quality of New Mexico's surface waters. So now I'm going to touch on a few of the different elements in the report. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is what we might expect in terms of increasing temperature. So this, again, on the left-hand side of this graph, we can see the historical variation in temperature. On the right-hand side, in the pink and red, is what we would expect for temperature over the next 50 years. And the bottom line is we will expect the temperature to increase as much, well, between 5 and 7 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 50 years. Precipitation, as I mentioned earlier, is likely to not change. The average precipitation stays more or less constant, although you can see that the kind of level of uncertainty in terms of precipitation on a year-to-year basis, or level of variability in precipitation on a year-to-year basis, increases. Again, suggesting more drought years and then interspersed with wetter years. How is that going to impact snowpack and stream runoff? These two graphs, the top one shows how stream runoff is going to change. The bottom one shows how snowpack is going to change. I'll address snowpack first. There are 4 different types of simulations of how snowpack will change, but the basic message is that snowpack in New Mexico will go down over the next 50 years. And correspondingly, stream flow is likely to go down as well. There's a little bit more variability between the different scenarios in terms of stream flow, but on average, it looks like stream flow will decrease. extreme precipitation. This is a really interesting aspect of this study. So based on basic physics, as our atmosphere warms and holds more moisture, we would expect more extreme precipitation events, these massive downpours that dump 10 inches of rain in 3 hours. We would expect that to happen more often going forward. However, because New Mexico is an arid state, the record of extreme precipitation, the record of precipitation over the last 20 years is notably variable. So it's quite difficult to use past behavior to predict future behavior. However, again, based on first principles, we would expect more extreme precipitation. And also the recently published International Panel on Climate Change, looking at data aggregated from the Southwest, has quite a robust forecast of increased extreme precipitation going forward. One of the authors of the report, Dr. Fred Phillips, is a specialist in land surface water budget. And this is information that he put together that I find incredibly, that I was very surprised about this, and I think it really gives us some insight into water resources in New Mexico. So Fred compiled a lot of information about precipitation in New Mexico, the fate of rain and snow that falls in New Mexico. And that's summarized in this cartoon. And each of the arrows on this cartoon represents a quantity of water in millions of acre feet per year. So on average in New Mexico, we get about 95 million acre feet of precipitation per year. What happens to that precipitation? 75 million acre feet of that 95 are taken up by plants and transpired. And so that is the lion's share of the precipitation that falls in New Mexico is taken up by plants and transpired back into the atmosphere. Now, another 17 million acre feet of that precipitation is evaporated directly from soil. So these two terms together, evaporation and transpiration, which a shorthand expression for that is evapotranspiration, represents 92 million acre feet of water compared to the 95 million acre feet of precipitation. So that is where most of the water is going. That only leaves a very small amount, 1.5 million acre feet for runoff, water that flows into surface channels, and 1.7 million acre feet that percolates down through New Mexico soil into subsurface aquifers. So this I thought was really revealing. And what it shows us is that as the atmosphere warms, the amount of runoff and recharge available becomes even smaller. And I'm going to touch on that in the next slide. So even with no trend in precipitation, with precipitation neither decreasing or increasing, New Mexico is going to become more arid going forward because of increasing air temperature. So the amount of water that air can hold, that can be absorbed into air, goes up as air temperature rises. A 2 degree Fahrenheit increase in atmospheric temperature allows the air to hold 7% more water vapor. So what that means is there's more evaporation and more transpiration. Liquid water is going to be lost more rapidly from leaves and soil, and leaving even less water available to run off or recharge. And as aridity increases, we can expect more severe droughts to occur. So those are a few kind of general truisms about how climate change is going to impact New Mexico. But we also, in the report, really delved into how different parts of New Mexico are going to be impacted by climate change. Now, say we were in Iowa, which is a relatively geographically monotone state, or we wouldn't really have to think so much about how different parts of the state are going to be impacted by climate change. But New Mexico is a state that is characterized by really varied landscape. We have very high mountains, we have low deserts, we have plains, we have mountainous regions, and you can't really paint the entire state with one brush with respect to how climate change is going to impact. So what we thought about in the report is how are different regions of New Mexico going to be impacted by climate change? Which parts of New Mexico are going to experience similar impacts in a warming climate? And we came up with 4 different general regions. And the first are the high mountain regions of New Mexico. And these are actually spread all over the state. So there are the high mountains in the north part of the state, the Sangre de Cristos, the Jemez Mountains. Then we also have the Dadamogollon volcanic field in the western part of the state that is relatively high mountains, and then the Sacramento Mountains in the southeast. So those parts, that is one geographic region of the state. The second is the Northwest High Desert. So this is the Colorado Plateau, the northwest corner of New Mexico, the Gallup Grants area. That's high desert, and we put that into a second region of the state. The third region is the Rio Grande Valley in the Southeast Basin. So that's region 3, which stretches down the middle of the state and then down into the southwest corner of the state. This is overall lower elevation, less mountainous, less vegetated. And then finally, the Eastern Plains. And the Eastern Plains are a big part of New Mexico. And we struggled a little bit with this, trying to decide whether we should try to divide them into 2 regions or leave them as one region. But we couldn't really find strong justification for dividing them. So we left them as a single region. And these 2 maps that I'm showing you are 2 maps of the aridity index for New Mexico. And the aridity index, simply put, is the amount of evaporation versus precipitation. So a bigger number means it's a more arid part of the state. Redder means more arid, blue means less arid. And you can see in these maps that the aridity index for New Mexico really closely mimics those geographic regions that I showed you in the last slide. So high mountain regions, the Southeast Basins, and the Rio Grande. And the 2 maps that I'm showing you here are historical aridity index for New Mexico, and then future projections. And you can see that the future projection shows, the entire state is going to become more arid. But the next map I'm going to show you is really important. And this is something even people that have already seen versions of this talk haven't seen this yet, because it's relatively new information. So what this shows is the percent increase in aridity index comparing the past with the future. And what it shows us is what are the parts of New Mexico that are going to be most impacted by climate change in terms of the relative aridity difference. And on this map, the hotter colors, the darker colors, are the areas that are going to experience the highest percent increase in aridity index. And those are the high mountains. You can see that very closely mimics our high mountain regions of New Mexico. So the message there is the high mountain regions are going to be the most impacted by climate change. So in the next couple of slides, I think I'm probably almost out of time here, Norm, but I just have a couple more minutes. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of the dominant impacts by region. So again, I mentioned the high mountains are going to be the most impacted by climate change, but the impacts of climate change in the high mountains will be felt throughout the state. There'll be less snowmelt, higher evaporation, and then importantly, there's going to be a lot of changes to plant communities and increase in wildfire that we've already seen in New Mexico. So, and these impacts will not only be felt in the mountains, but in the more downstream areas. The Northwest High Desert, the northwest part of the state, will see slightly different impacts, likely to have loss of soil, increased dustiness, increased arroyo incision, and possible transition from more grassy plants to more shrubby plants. The Rio Grande Valley Basin and Range, interestingly, kind of counterintuitively, is going to have probably the least dramatic changes relative as climate changes, because the relative change in aridity index is going to be probably the lowest throughout the whole state. However, these areas will experience lower river flows because of the impacts of climate change in the high mountains. And the projection is that there'll be 25% lower flow in the Rio Grande in 50 years. Changing in timing of runoff, also trending earlier. And then another really important thing is greater loss of water from reservoirs. So with a 5-degree temperature increase, Elephant Butte will lose an additional 2 acre-feet or 2 feet of water per year. And then finally, the Eastern Plains. The Eastern Plains is likely to be the part of New Mexico that is most impacted by extreme precipitation events. Also, like the northwest corner of the state, there'll be losses of soil, increased desertification, and increased dustiness. And I do have a couple of slides about data gaps and research directions, but I think, Norm, I probably used up my time here. And I will just say a couple of words in closing, which is that the impacts of climate change on New Mexico are overwhelmingly negative. And I know when I talk to people about this, it's discouraging to hear all these things, but I think you really have to have about what's happening here. And unless we have an idea of what we'll be facing in the future, there's no way that we can plan for and try to address the future, the water future that we'll be facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelia. Hannah, would you start with a brief introduction of yourself, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Norm. And I'll try to pull my slides up here as well. Hold on one second. There we go. Perfect. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hannah Riseley-White, and as Norm said, I'm the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission Deputy Director. I grew up here in New Mexico. I left for around 20 years and then actually interned at New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission while I was working on a master's degree that was an interdisciplinary degree in science and policy. So I am now doing exactly what I hope to do, which is to work with folks like Nelia and then bridge the gap based on the information like what she provided tonight to our decision makers and policy makers. I'm excited to be with you all this evening. Thank you all for the opportunity, and I really appreciate seeing so many folks on and interested in this critical issue, which ultimately will affect all of us across the state. And I also would like to just say I feel really grateful to have folks like my fellow panelists and many others on this evening to learn from as a new generation, as Norm said, of folks trying to tackle these issues, these incredible challenges, and looking forward to working with all of you more. I thought I'd just take a minute initially you just heard from Nelia, and as she just said, the information she presented is pretty bleak, but it's important for us to sort of hit everybody over the head with it, because this is real, and we need to tackle it, and we need to be thinking about it now. And so, the major problems facing New Mexico in the coming decades, she just summarized, they're reframed on this slide. We're looking at persistent drought being exacerbated by rising average annual temperatures, the potential for catastrophic wildfires resulting from watersheds devastated by drought. And I think if something, we weren't hit over the head, we were this past summer with the record-breaking wildfires that we experienced in New Mexico. So climate change is not something that's out in the future. It's very much real and something we're experiencing now. We're also going to be needing to prepare for declining aquifers resulting from reduced surface water supplies and the change in the water balance that Nelia went over in her slide, which was super helpful, Nelia, thank you. We also have aging water and wastewater infrastructure, and in particular challenges facing our rural communities across the state and needing to think through how we support those folks. We have a real need for stormwater control investments as the potential for intense monsoon storm events rises. And we have consistent lack of funding for proper human capacity development at all levels of government. So state government, but also local governments across the state and the private sector. And we have a real need for long view planning and investment to correct years of underfunding. So there's major challenges ahead. And as I just said, we clearly are already experiencing these changes as we saw this year. And ultimately, these changes will affect all New Mexicans in one way or another. Therefore, we have a real need to plan for resilience now. I think that we have a couple of paths in front of us. The path of inaction doesn't feel like an option to me, and also feels like something that will just lead us into prolonged conflict and litigation that's very costly, rather than investing our resources in preparing for the solutions ahead. So resilience, as we've been defining it in our work at the state, is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. And so this need to plan for resilience is critical for the economic viability of our communities across the state. And I think it's important, as we've been working on the 50-year water plan, people say, oh, 50 years seems far out, right? But I think that where we are 50 years from now will depend on the actions that we take in the next couple of years, right? So where you start helps determine where you land. So time is of the essence. And as I just said, we're also seeing these impacts. So it's critical that we address them sooner rather than later. This is truly an all hands on deck moment. This is not a problem that the state can solve alone. We are going to need solid partnerships with federal agencies and with communities and water user groups across the state to solve these challenges. Now, all of this said, there's some really good news. And I think for those of you who've been on, I presented at the first of this series as well. And I think some of the information in my slides may be repetitive from that, but I think what I'm trying to do here is to tie it all up in a bundle in terms of what do we do, right? So here's the situation we're facing. How do we move forward? And the good news is that an incredible effort has happened that I'm going to speak to in more detail now over the last couple of years to tee up a really solid set of recommendations in terms of the actions that are needed for us to confront the changes that Nelia just outlined. And I'm going to go through those a little bit now, and then I'll sort of summarize our perspective and what we're looking at heading into the legislative session. So, as many of you know, the Interstate Stream Commission was directed by the governor's office to prepare a 50-year water plan. This is remarkable in that it's the first time New Mexico's planning program has really confronted climate change head on. So obviously much needed. As Nelia spoke to, we started with what the shorthand for us is the Leap Ahead report, the report that she just presented on. And I think it's if you haven't looked at it, I very much encourage you to look at it. I think it was an incredible first step. And as Nelia said, we needed very much to look to the scientific community to help give us the hard facts, give us the reality here of what we're facing so that we can then plan to confront that. And so I really want to acknowledge Nelia's effort, which was tremendous, to carry that, and then all of the panelists who participated and peer review, et cetera, in pulling that report together. I also wanted to flag that we did conduct 10 webinars hosted by Interstate Stream Commission with the panelists on the different chapters that Nelia spoke to. And I think I'll ask Andrew Erdman, who's on, if he can drop the link to those webinars into the chat. They were not on our website, but now they are, or they were, but they've taken off and now they're back. So I very much encourage you all to check those out. They're incredibly informative. And so I don't know if everyone can see the chat, but if the organizers can make sure that others see that afterwards or at some point, that would be very helpful. We then transitioned as part of the 50-year plan to do a resilience assessment in which we engaged with all kinds of water users from different sectors across the state, and also worked pretty closely with our state agency partners to help us think through what does, given that definition of resilience, what does that mean about what we need to do? And so that was very useful. We also hosted 12 different webinars related to that and worked very closely as well with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Coming out of that process, we developed recommendations for the plan, and I just want to really acknowledge the incredibly wide range of partners who participated in that, from just individuals across the state to organizations and different groups that weighed in. In particular, our sister state agencies, the Water Resources Research Institute, Water Dialogue, annual meetings. There's a formation of a tribal water work group, which we hope will continue into the future to inform state water planning, meetings with the Sakia communities, and then we had an online platform in which we gathered input as well. And I also just want to acknowledge we're trying to think through how we engage with an even broader audience. I think we did a very good job of communicating and gathering input from folks who are already pretty engaged in water issues, but to the extent anyone on here has suggestions on mechanisms to engage with a broader audience, certainly we would welcome those. Also, as I said, I arrived at Interstate Stream Commission through an internship I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about capacity building and want to think through how do we build more opportunities to engage young people and create a pipeline for water professionals. This is incredibly interesting work. So other folks on who have ideas about that, I would welcome that as well. So anyways, quite a process in developing the plan recommendations. And one of those recommendations was and is to form a water policy and infrastructure task force. So more on that in just a minute. Just broadly speaking, the recommendations in the 50-year plan are grouped into sort of these three categories: stewardship, sustainability, and equity. However, it's important to recognize that there's a lot of overlap. This really is more of a Venn diagram because equity is related to all of them. So anyways, there's definitely, excuse me, definitely overlap within this set of recommendations. Within each of the 10 recommendations that you see on this honeycomb diagram, there's a series of action steps that are being recommended by the state. And I know that many of you are probably just very anxiously awaiting the release of this plan. We've been working pretty closely with the governor's office over the last couple of months to add some more specificity to those recommendations. So there are now some critical action steps, and we're looking forward to releasing that soon. It's in final phases of review with the governor's office. All right, and as I said, one of the plan recommendations called for the formation of this water policy and infrastructure task force. That was the focus of the first presentation that I participated in. And several of my fellow task force members are on this evening, so good to see you all. This was again directed by the governor. The state engineer convened this large task force with broad representation from across the state, from different water use sectors, as well as different geographies. There are 20 citizen members of the task force, again, representing all the interests listed on the slide. In addition, there are 9 agency reps on the task force representing all of the water related agencies as well as finance. So Department of Finance Administration, New Mexico Finance Authority. We really wanted everybody there to participate in crafting a set of recommendations that would essentially add some more specificity to the recommendations in the 50-year plan. And I gotta also acknowledge we had incredible support for the task force from both New Mexico First, who convened and facilitated the process, as well as the Utton Center, who supported through research and writing, and are essentially the 2 principal objectives in the task force charter were to provide a review of the 50-year plan, which the task force did in the draft before the critical action steps that I just mentioned over the summer, and provided valuable input there. And then to develop really specific recommendations for how to address what is it that we need to do to address the challenges that Nelia spoke to earlier. It was a consensus-based process. And as you can imagine, that sort of broad representation of water interests was challenging in terms of reaching consensus. And it's pretty remarkable, the set of solutions that we came to in terms of recommendations. So the task force self-formed into 3 work groups: the community drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater capacity, infrastructure, and finance group, the water resources management and planning group, and then the river, aquifer, and watershed health group. In total, the task force put forward 17 recommendations coming from those 3 work groups with either broad or 100% task force support. So again, that's remarkable, and kudos to New Mexico First for helping us facilitate us through that process. More information on the task force can be found at the website nmwater.org, and the task force report is just finalized this week, and I actually think it is available on the Utton Center's website if everyone wants to look for that. It'll be on nmwater.org soon as well. So maybe before I speak to this slide, I just should also say, through all of that engagement over the past 2 years, with all the different sort of expertise from across the state and all the different water user groups, what's remarkable to me is if you look at the task force recommendations and then the 50-year plan recommendations, there is broad consensus amongst sort of water experts across the state about what it is that we need to do. So there is a very clear path forward presented in those two documents. This is a once in a lifetime moment, I think. I keep thinking about whether or not this is this magic moment where, you know, is there the political will to act? There's tremendous state and federal funding, unprecedented state and federal funding. And then the motivation of what we saw this past summer with those significant wildfires and drought across the state. So can we seize this moment to make some really transformative change in terms of how we manage water in New Mexico and helping our communities prepare for the challenges ahead? And that's the question, especially heading into our legislative session that starts next week. So I'm probably going too fast, or maybe I'm almost out of time here. Wanted to speak just a little bit to the current executive budget recommendation, which dropped yesterday from the governor's office. And we're still getting a handle on this a little bit. This slide presents information related to the budget for New Mexico Office of the State Engineer and Interstate Stream Commission, but it doesn't summarize budget information for our other sister agencies, NMED or MNRD or others. And there's lots in the recommendations from the task force and the 50-year plan that's related to all of those agencies. As I said earlier, it's very much going to need to be an all hands on deck effort in terms of dealing with the water management challenges that we're facing. What is incredibly remarkable about the governor's budget, and that I'd like to really highlight, is there are huge water related special appropriations requests. The budget that dropped yesterday has over $283 million proposed for expenditures over the next approximately 5 years. The various requests included each have different timeframes associated with them, but collectively the range of timeframes is over the next 5 years. And this is huge. It's actually everything that we asked for the agency in terms of special appropriations requests was granted and more. So of that 283 million, I've listed some on this slide, not all, but of what's included in those specials. So $75 million for work in the Lower Rio Grande. And I'd like to say, I know that probably people are like, wow, that's huge. But there's a major challenge for New Mexico in that part of the basin, and a real need for us to show commitment to our fellow compact states that we're taking the issue seriously and working to resolve those issues. So that's why that number is so big. In addition, there's 75 million made available as matching funds for federal funding in order to help New Mexico leverage federal funding for water projects. That's also huge. And we're gonna have a big task ahead of us in terms of figuring out how to get that money out on the ground and where it's best utilized. In addition, there's $36 million for work at Interstate Stream Commission on the Middle Rio Grande, Colorado, and Pecos basins. A lot of that is drought related, channel optimization, species, habitat, conveyance issues, etc. included in there. In addition, we received 10 million, or the recommendation. So just want to be clear here, we haven't received this funding yet. This is what's in the governor's recommendation. $10 million for the Strategic Water Reserve, which would be incredibly helpful. And the request there is for that money to be non-reverting, so that we've had an issue administering the reserve in the past when we get appropriations, but they have a very tight time frame. It's hard for us to get that money out on the ground. So hopefully we'll receive that funding and then be able to have it for a longer time frame so that we can really utilize it. Also included is $6 million for water planning. And that's really exciting because there's a lot of planning that's needed, as we're talking about here. And that funding could also go towards implementing or supporting implementation of other of the task force recommendations. So something that we'll want to continue to work with those task force members, who we also refer to as water ambassadors, on figuring out next steps on that funding. And then in addition, there's a $5 million special request for the Asakian Community Ditch Infrastructure Fund in order to get more funds out on the ground to those folks. So those are just a few pieces. It is, as I said, significant. And we're excited to see that level of support from the governor's office. In addition, we had requested some expansions with regards to our recurring budget. So those special appropriations are one-time funding, even if we have a multi-year time frame in which we can expend them. Of our requests, what's included in the governor's recommendation is 5 additional FTEs, some additional funding for base salary increases, and some additional funding to support water planning expenditures. So not necessarily staff, but projects that might be related to water funding. And those are all excellent. However, as you can see on there, we'll have a little bit of a challenge in getting all of this money on the ground without additional capacity. And so we're currently working to explore with the governor's office, to what extent we can, use some of those specials to increase our capacity to actually carry forward this work. I should also say that part of the work that the state engineer has been doing with the governor's office is to really look at how to increase state agency capacity or OSE's capacity over the coming 2 or 3 years. So we're very glad to see the additional 5 FTEs in the governor's recommendation and hope to continue to work with her and her staff to increase that over the next few years so that we can not only carry out the current work that we have in front of us, but take on these major challenges that we're facing. And I think just I'll end with this. I'm looking forward to your questions. I'm glad to see so many folks on and very much wanting to carry forward next steps in terms of this important work. And Norm, with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Hannah. And Nelia, that was very informative summary presentations. I'm Norm Gaume. I'm president of the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates. I'm a New Mexican. I grew up in southern New Mexico. I was Interstate Stream Commission director from 1997 to 2002, so I'm way out of date, except that I was selected to be a water ambassador. And so I'm going to talk to you from the perspective of an advocate about all of this work and where we need to go. So let's get started. I'm going to jump right in and talk about 2023 water legislation that I'm aware of, or that for sure is going to be dropped, and I will tie that to task force recommendations and have some comments about that. And I'll come back to this in a little bit in more detail about some of the pieces of this. One of the major items of legislation is the Regional Water Resilience Planning Act. It's an act that would reform water planning, regional water resilience planning in New Mexico to be forward-looking, science-based, involving all the stakeholders in the planning, and encouraging that people get together in their regions and vet and prioritize, develop, vet, and prioritize the changes, the projects they need, the changes in policies, the actions, so that we have community-based water planning to inform the state's actions. It's very important that the community develop these regional plans with state guidance and support. So that act will be introduced. I'll give you more information about that in a moment. We have the special appropriations. Hannah just reviewed the special appropriations that are in the governor's budget recommendation. There are a whole host of specific task force recommendations that have to do with agency capacity, and almost all of those need to be turned into a work plan and a schedule and a budget. And so what the Middle Rio Grande water advocates hope is to work with the legislature so that there's language attached to these special appropriations that would provide for the recommendation of agency capacity increases. That's so critical. You know, one comment with all of the budget that's been granted, the agencies don't have the staff to productively and efficiently spend that money. And so that needs to be fixed, and it requires people and a lot of other things. A specific recommendation that came out of the task force is to provide the state engineer with enforcement authority. The state engineer has agreed for a bill on that. I haven't seen it yet, but I know it's out there. I understand that the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department will have 3 bills pertaining to forest and watershed health. The recommendations that came out of the River, Aquifer, and Watershed Health Work Group of the task force. There may be a bill to implement a new way of putting projects on the ground throughout the state. Right now, there's not local capacity to do that. There's not state capacity to give guidance. And so one of the task force recommendations was to create a quasi-governmental water projects implementation authority that would basically help local regions build capacity so that they can manage their infrastructure, build their projects, and take steps to increase their resilience over the long run. There's a bill to increase the strategic water reserve by $25 million. That was a specific task force recommendation. I see the governor's recommendation has 10 million. So perhaps there will be more available through the legislative process. The next 3 bills are bills that Senate Majority Leader Peter Wirth is sponsoring. One would provide for the voluntary organization of small water systems, in a particular area, into regional water authorities so that they could share resources, operation and maintenance staff, and basically have more capacity by reducing overhead of all the individual small systems. Senator Wirth will have a bill to change the way that the Interstate Stream Commission appointments are made. The governor appoints all the members of the Interstate Stream Commission. Senator Wirth's bill would change the commission into a nonpartisan commission with balanced representation from the political parties to guide New Mexico's water policy. And lastly on this list, Senator Wirth has sponsored a bill to put $250 million of the windfall revenue that we have this year into a water project fund that was created years ago that funds infrastructure currently, and we hope will be modified slightly so that it is designed to implement projects that are developed through developed, vetted, recommended, prioritized, and approved through the Regional Water Resilience Planning Program. Task Force Recommendation 2.1, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't be referring to these by number. The report's available to you. I'm not sure what I did. Hang on just a minute. Okay. Task Force Recommendation 2.1 has to do with increasing the water agency's capacity to get the work done that we need them to do. The wording of the action associated with the recommendation is in blue, and I'm going to read it to you. Equip state agencies, especially the Office of the State Engineer, the Interstate Stream Commission, and the New Mexico Environment Department to effectively address New Mexico's 21st century emerging water security challenges and realize resilient adaptation through enhanced agency capacity, organizational alignment, cross-agency coordination, modernized business practices, modernized information systems, and accountability. This proactive legislation, the recommendation includes, and the list is long, and I would, if you're interested, I'd urge you to read the recommendations in the task force report, what it has to say about them. But it calls for proactive legislation to address and adjust the Interstate Stream Commission and the Office of the State Engineer's mission and functions to specifically address climate-driven water scarcity. It calls for enforcement against illegal water use. The background story there is that the state engineer's existing enforcement authority under existing statutes make his enforcement against illegal water use almost impossible. There are stories about people who are illegally diverting more than their permits, where the cost of penalties associated with the state engineer's existing authority are just a cost of doing business. It doesn't keep them from continuing to divert more water than they are entitled to. And that can be easily fixed by merely giving the state engineer the same enforcement authority that the New Mexico Environment Department already has. There are many things that are associated with capacity in these agencies, the staff to get the jobs done, that the agencies already have, much of which they can't do, and to also address new challenges. The state engineer and the Office of the State Engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission depend on science, technology, engineering, and math type disciplines to do their jobs. It's their technical jobs. Those people are scarce. The salaries are not currently competitive, and that has to be fixed in order to increase the capacity. And the capacity is absolutely essential across the board in the water arena. They need modern technology. Some of their legacy software systems and hardware is just on its last legs and really doesn't get the job done. Business processes are still paper-based, quite inefficient. Those all need to be brought into the 21st century as quickly as possible so that the existing staff can be more productive. The state needs to invest in the productivity of state employees, state staff, particularly in the water agencies. The capacity deficits also exist at the local level. We must build basically a career pipeline for water people to serve locally and in other positions in order to be able to plan, design, and build water projects. New Mexico is short on engineers, and we have a lot of work to do. So this is just a very high level recommendation or overview of the capacity recommendations. And I would urge you to read more if you're interested. Task Force Recommendation 2.2, and I'm only going to cover 2 of the 8 water management and planning recommendations because in my view, they're at the very top of the list. This particular recommendation of the task force was unanimously approved. I think the capacity recommendation had 1 no vote. Only 1 of the task force members voted against it. The action associated with this recommendation reads, empower state agencies and regional and local resilience planning entities, and we don't have any right now, regional local water resilience planning entities, to set clearly identified goals for permanent and escalating reduction in water use over the coming decades. To provide data, they need to provide data and decision, or we need to provide data and decision tools, develop inclusive and well-supported water planning development processes, and establish pathways and commit resources to ensure plan implementation, and this is very important, and systematic evaluation of the outcomes. Some of the major points from this recommendation are that the existing water planning statute, which was passed in 1987 in defense of Texas's attempt to drill wells in New Mexico and export groundwater from New Mexico into Texas, that law has served its purpose. It's done, that part is over. And so we need to amend the existing regional water planning statute so that it looks forward at climate change resilience, and it's much more than a defensive statute that we started with. Another key part of the recommendation is to leverage record surpluses to fully fund a robust state-led regional water planning program. I was delighted to see the $6 million in water planning funds, and hopefully some of that and other special appropriation dollars can be assigned to get the regional water planning program designed and underway. Another recommendation is that we need to create community-based and science-informed sustainable groundwater management plans. Much of New Mexico relies on groundwater as its sole source. And in many areas of the state, the groundwater is overtapped, water tables are falling. If we continue the status quo, we will end up with aquifers that are drained, as has already occurred in the Ogallala Aquifer on the east side of New Mexico. The recommendation point is to develop that the Interstate Stream Commission should develop protocols for integrating reliable science and data into the regional water resilience planning process. Some of the water plans of the past have really not been based on reliable science and data. It's essential that, that all of the plans heretofore be prepared with scientific integrity and that they utilize adequate and reliable data. If adequate and reliable data doesn't exist, then the first task in planning has got to be to collect it. There's a specific recommendation to provide support to underserved tribal governments and disadvantaged communities. That is absolutely necessary if we're going to make an equitable climate change transition with regard to our water. And then finally, we need to establish, the Interstate Stream Commission needs to establish conservation, resilience, and sustainability criteria against which the regional water resilience plans will be evaluated and approved if they meet the standards. I'm now going to switch to the Regional Water Resilience Planning Act. Water planning is has been basically a huge part of my career. I think that if you don't plan your work and work your plan, that that taking random steps will not get us to where we need to be. So on the basis of my participation in the Water Task Force, after the task force recommendations were completed and even before, we began drafting the Regional Water Resilience Planning Act. The current news is that Senator Liz Stefanik has agreed to sponsor that bill. We are looking for bipartisan, bicameral sponsors. Those have not been secured as of this time. And our current status with regard to the bill is at Senator Stefanik's direction, The water advocates are currently working intensively with Interstate Stream Commission staff and leadership to refine the concepts and language in that draft bill so that they would find it acceptable. They might not be able to support it unless they get permission from the governor, but they are working with us so that they could live with this bill if it were to pass. A presentation on the bill is scheduled for the Interstate Stream Commission at January 17th. I think that we need more public involvement in Interstate Stream Commission meetings. So if you're interested in this, you could drop into that meeting and hear the presentation. And I expect that the bill will be dropped near the beginning of the legislative session, which again starts, I believe, a week from yesterday. Some of the elements of the act, what it does, it provides statutory requirements and authority at the state and regional level for the regional water resilience planning program. So it lays out the authorities and how the state will work with the regions to get these plans underway, developed, approved, and implemented. The bill specifies high-level Interstate Stream Commission roles and responsibilities, and it directs them to fill in the details that can't be provided in a statutory framework, either through the promulgation of rules or the issuance of guidelines, both of which would be generated through a broad public process. So the bill would authorize this, and then the details would come with great public input opportunities. Regional water resilience planning entities would be created by this bill. The entities would establish goals and their statutory guidelines in the bill for those goals. After the entities originally organize, and that may be with the active support and assistance of the Interstate Stream Commission, they would get state funding to prepare detailed work plans. Those plans would be submitted, negotiated, and when approved, then state funding would flow to the regions to prepare their regional water resilience plans, and also plans for at-risk communities that are within the region. The statute provides for the Interstate Stream Commission's rigorous review and approval of submitted plans. At the current time, in the past programs, the Interstate Stream Commission has accepted the plans, and they haven't really been rigorously reviewed. When they're finished, they've been accepted, and no successful implementation has occurred. And one of the reasons for that is the word implementation, or the concept of implementation, is missing from the 1987 statute, which has governed the work to date. The entities would be responsible for coming up with projects, activities, and policies. And very importantly, they would be responsible for vetting and prioritizing those and putting them forth in plans that they would submit for approval after negotiations and the correction or addition of additional material as the ISC would require to meet their rules and guidelines and the statute. The regions would then, their plans would be recommended by the Interstate Stream Commission for the legislature to appropriate, or for other project implementation mechanisms to fund the implementation of those plans. And the concept is that the state would provide matching funding, and that we need to maximize the use of federal infrastructure dollars. And I believe that those federal infrastructure dollars will be there. And then I've already said this, it would be the region's responsibility to implement their plans with state support. And I'm having trouble. There we go. And I want to wrap this all up for you. The Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates has adopted what we call a theory of change. How do we get to an equitable, balanced, and resilient water future? How can we transform water governance in New Mexico so that it is equitable, balanced, and resilient? And we believe that happens in a number of different ways. You are participating in a forum tonight and learning. We hope that you will reach out to your state senator and your state representative and ask them to pay attention to water and to fund our transition to our climate change future. We haven't really faced that future yet, but from the information you've seen already, it's incumbent that we do that. At the top of the slides, discussions, problem-solving discussions, and structured problem-solving processes. The water planning process is one of those. The task force process has been a structured problem-solving process. Through that, we gain allies, we gain public awareness, and ultimately where we are right now, right before the 2023 legislature, is to get decision makers to authorize and fund what we need to do and change policies, including the legislation that is before them and legislation that is to come. And so I will conclude and open it up to your questions. So let's see. Nelia, I believe that you have some questions in front of you. Would you like to address?
Yeah, what I
first?
might suggest, Norm, is I could do my first question and then Hannah could do a question and you could do a question. So, because there's quite a few in mind, but I'll address the first one, which is, might a trend in precipitation appear when considering pre-industrial data? And, you know, that's a great question. And I think the thing that is a little bit tricky, the data that I showed you are instrumental data. So that's actual measurements of rainfall. But if you go back much, let's see, 1900 in New Mexico, there isn't much instrumental data available. So then you have to rely on proxies instead of direct measurements. And the proxy, one of the proxies that is most valuable are tree rings. And tree ring data goes back fairly far. And while I pulled up a graph, and I don't think I'll share the screen because it'll take a little bit too long, but I found some tree ring data that goes back 1400 years, so well pre-industrial. And there's variability, and also tree ring data doesn't give you absolute amount of precipitation. It just gives you relative amounts. So you look at years when the tree rings are big and when they're small, and there's variation around a mean, but there's no particular trend. So going back 1400 years, again, there's variability, no real trend. Now, if you go way back to the last glacial maximum, 25,000 years ago, yes, it was cooler and there was a lot more precipitation. But during, I would say, you know, and then you can't go back much further than 1400 years ago with tree rings because there's just no trees that really exist to give you the record. So there's a bit of a gap there. But the simple answer is, if you look pre-industrial going back 1400 years, no, there's no specific trend in precipitation.
Thank you, Hannah.
Sure. It looks like the first question that is being assigned to me is about how the Indigenous communities will be involved in future collaboration and water issues. And what I'd like to say is that it's absolutely imperative that we form partnerships and work with the Indigenous communities in New Mexico. It was incredibly valuable for New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission that we work closely with Indian Affairs Department, who convened this tribal water work group that I mentioned earlier, to provide input to the 50-year plan. For all those folks who participated in that process, it was incredibly helpful. And one of the things that we took away from that was that we need to continue that effort into the future to help inform the state's water planning processes onward. So we're looking forward to continuing to do that into the future. And I think that's my answer to that question. Norm?
Thanks, Hannah. The question that I will answer is, how many regional water entities do you expect to be created? And the number will be up to the Interstate Stream Commission to determine if the Regional Water Resilience Planning Act passes. But in discussions with the Interstate Stream Commission staff and the state engineer, I believe the number will be somewhere between 6 and 10. One possibility is the Navajo Nation might be a region, and the remainder of the west side of the state divided into 3 regions. 3 regions in the center state corresponding to the upper, middle, and lower Rio Grande, and 2 or 3 regions on the east side. And the issue is that each of these regional water plans is going to be a major effort to put together, and it's going to require major amounts of Interstate Stream Commission staff support, funding, models, data. There's the amount of work for state agency staff goes up in proportion to the number of regions. So the number of regions has to be manageable. But again, the final number will be up to the Interstate Stream Commission when they do their rulemaking or guidelines. Nelia?
And maybe Norm, if I could just piggyback on that, I think that I'd just like to say that we at Interstate Stream Commission have learned a lot from the various iterations of regional planning that have already occurred, and are looking forward very much to engaging with the public in sort of rethinking what those regions need to look like to be most effective, and to line up with sort of communities that share a same source hydrologically. So anyways, to be continued, and we look forward to a conversation with all of you. And also, just to add to my last answer a tiny bit, I wanted to say that there will be in the 50-year plan a brief short version of the Tribal Water Work Group's recommendations. In addition, that group spent a lot of effort on a much longer document that will be released in parallel to the plan. So stay tuned on that as well. Thanks. And I think we go back to Nelia now.
Okay, so the next question on my list is, how do New Mexico models integrate with models for the remainder of the lower 48 states? And what I would say to that is the New Mexico climate picture, we focus very narrowly on New Mexico in the Leap Ahead report, because that was our charge. However, the climate story for the arid Southwest is very consistent with what we describe in our report. And I think if a really great source of information for that is the most recently published International Panel on Climate Change. So the New Mexico picture is very consistent with the arid Southwest. However, the question asked about the lower 48, and the climate change picture is really dramatically different in different parts of the US. So for instance, the kind of northeastern Midwest part of the United States is expected to get a lot more precipitation. So it's not one picture for the whole lower 48. It's there are different climate pictures for different regions of the lower 48. And again, the International Panel on Climate Change report is a great source of information on looking at the country more broadly.
Okay, great. And I think it's back to me again here. The next question I see for me is, could the panelists help us understand where riparian habitat, wildlife refuges, and management areas fit in terms of the 50-year plan? And I guess what I would say to that question is, of the 10 recommendations in the plan, 3 are about stewardship. 1 is focused on upland watershed health. The second of those is focused on rivers and riparian areas. And then the third is focused on groundwater management. And each of those have significant recommended action steps and then critical action steps that speak to the tremendous need for us to protect our water resources at their sources, and to protect the natural systems that support those, including, a lot of support for our colleagues at MNRD and their forest action plan with regards to upland watershed health. And so in answer to your question, the 50-year plan very much acknowledges that protecting those areas is going to be critical, not only for their own sake, but for the water users who depend on those. And Norm?
Thanks, Hannah. My next question is $6 million in the governor's budget sufficient to plan for regional water resilience? And I think the answer is that it's great to get that water planning money to the Interstate Stream Commission. They have 2 charges, I believe, with the language that the governor attached to this special appropriation, the $6 million. And that is to implement the 50-year water plan and to prepare the every 5-year update to the state water plan. And I don't want to speak for Hannah, perhaps she should answer this, but I believe the $6 million, if we get the appropriate language associated with that special appropriation, will be sufficient for the Interstate Stream Commission to design the program and to begin to put it in place, which will take more than a year to get that done. So the money is sufficient to get it started. What's not adequate, absolutely not adequate, is the number of water planning staff. And as to the big picture, one of the initial tasks for the state engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission in the water planning, the Water Resilience Planning Act that we hope will be passed, is to estimate the schedule and the budget requirements to put all of these plans in place across the board. And just for my guess at the number, I'm thinking that could be a $20 to $30 million endeavor. But what we absolutely need to get out of this legislative session and for the governor to sign off on is more staff for our water management agencies, and that's across the board. I guess one other comment I would make, I'm delighted to see that the governor has stepped up and has allocated funding, serious funding for water. That has not yet happened in her administration in the previous 4 years. So that is very encouraging. But what is even more encouraging are the number of legislators who are expressing their support to get serious about water in New Mexico and the things we need to do. And so thank you for that question. Nelia?
Okay.
I think we're actually at time. Just check the clock. So I want to show one last slide, and then I want to talk about where we go from here. This is in closing, and it's kind of Thank you for being here tonight. We really appreciate your participation and your interest in water. And going forward, I think that we need to get as many New Mexicans as we can. And in particular, our elected leaders, to think water and act now. As Hannah said, it's really an all hands on deck moment. And the longer we wait to get started, the more of our future opportunities are going to be foreclosed by the passing of time. And so we have to get started. We ask that you keep water in your daily conversations. We ask that you contact your state senator and your state representative and any other legislators that you may know, and ask them to support our water agencies to implement the 50-year water plan and to implement the Water Task Force recommendations. The Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates is sponsoring a rally at the Roundhouse outside on the steps at the Capitol on January 26th at 11 a.m. We would ask that you join us. Bring your sign. We want to make some noise. We want to let everybody know that it's time to think water, act now, and secure New Mexico's equitable water future. Would you please take 2 minutes to complete the survey that will appear in your browser when you leave this meeting? We would like your feedback about yourself and the meeting. And lastly, this is a complete change from the topics we've been talking about. But I want to take this opportunity to ask you to consider, if you're very interested in water and want to be active and an advocate, nominate yourself or somebody else that you know for election to the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates Board. We have a large board. And we are working to involve them in our advocacy efforts to transform New Mexico's water future. You can contact us at the email address shown on this slide. So thank you very much for attending this, this Zoom meeting, and I hope to see you at the legislature. Good evening.
Norm, should I send my slides to you or to Brittany?
Send them to Brittany, please. And
Okay.
Hannah, I'll ask Hannah to do the same. Thank you, Nelia.
I think Hannah already shared hers.
Okay, great.
Sent them earlier today, but I was still tweaking mine, so I will do that right now.
Yes, I have Hannah's.
I loved your beautiful slides. Made me embarrassed about my all word slides.
I'm going to stop the recording now.